Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We can't see you, but we can see the chat. And obviously, I think there's a way we'll see if you have questions. And I just want to say I'm David Jackson from the BGA, and I'm with Kelly Bauer of Block Club Chicago. And this session is for you. And so please don't hesitate to raise questions in the chat. And what we're going to do is talk about using FOIA in the context of a very fast-moving breaking news investigation. And so Kelly's going to sort of outline what she did and how she started this investigation and launched it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the FOIAs. We're going to take about probably 10 or 15 minutes total to leave time for questions and thoughts.
All right. So actually a little short of a year ago now, we're coming up on the anniversary, Block Club got a tip that there had been some improper vaccinations done at Trump Tower. We worked that like we would any typical story. We found some sources and dug up information to try to figure out who was vaccinated, did this event actually occur, who were the healthcare providers that were vaccinating people. And that then led to a series of stories about executives at Loretto Hospital improperly vaccinating people at Trump Tower, at a luxury jewelry and watch store, at a fancy Gold Coast steakhouse, at a church, and even at people's homes in the suburbs. So for the beginnings of those stories, they were mostly just focused on getting tips from information and finding ways to verify that. So things like asking to see people's vaccination cards or trying to find records that showed these vaccinations had been done. While all that was happening, I was also getting a lot of tips just more generally about how things worked at Loretto Hospital. Things like people saying, you know, the CFO's best friend and neighbor and business partner was getting improper contracts at the hospital, that people weren't being necessarily taken care of in the way they thought they should be at the hospital. And I knew that I wanted to have a reporting partner to help dig into this. So that's when Block Club reached out to BGA, and I was able to partner with David Jackson, who's been very generous with his time. And that's when we started using even more kind of public records, and then using FOIA to obtain records that had been private to us. So I think it was the first story, technically the first story published, that we worked on together, Dave, right, where we used a FOIA.
It was, but I just gotta, you're being so modest as you present this, I just gotta tell people a couple things about it. First of all, this investigation that Kelly launched happened during a time period when Chicagoans and Americans in general were desperate for shots. And the sort of the line jumping and the favoritism that her first stories exposed in a really riveting way were outrageous. And especially in the context, Loretto Hospital is there and was prioritized by the government to serve Black and brown Chicagoans, and vaccinations in a fancy Gold Coast steakhouse and a jewelry store or of those people obviously ran against that. And then the other thing I just want to say that Kelly's modestly not saying is that this was intensely competitive journalism. Every outlet in the city was really trying to get a step ahead of things, and Kelly kept breaking the scoops and breaking the news story after story.
Thanks, BJ. But yeah, so when we partnered with Dave Jackson, I think one of the first things we talked about was how, as part of Loretto's investigation into these vaccinations, they had agreed that they would do an audit of all the doses they had. But once that audit was completed, we learned that they had done it themselves. It was internal. They hadn't even gotten, you know, an outside party to conduct it. And all they would release was a very short, I think it was 1-page summary, basically saying, like, we did all our vaccinations well, and like patting themselves on the back for that. they wouldn't release any actual data about it, or any kind of like in-depth look at the vaccinations, how the audit was done, how they determined things were proper. So I believe it was Jackson who then, and also, sorry about that. I believe it was Jackson who came up with the idea that, well, they released this information, the full audit, to the city or Illinois health department. So why don't we just FOIA them for copies? Which was a very brilliant workaround because they had just flat out refused to share it with us in any way.
Can the people in the session see? I'm also having trouble sharing my screen. Can people in the session see somebody? No? Okay. Okay, so we're just going to forego doing that. But yes, what we did was, again, as Kelly says, trying to find a workaround, trying to find a way that any government agency would intersect with the phenomenon we're trying to report on. And so the thing that you would do as a reporter always is put on your thinking cap and try to say to yourself, okay, how is any government agency going to intersect with the private company, in this case, a hospital that I'm writing about, and oversee it? And I really encourage people to be super creative about doing that. Back when phone books were printed, they used to have a section in the front called the blue pages that listed all government agencies in an area. So you would take the Chicago phone book and there would be the blue pages in the front of the government agencies. When I was starting in this business, I used to literally reread that, 20-page blue pages section, just asking myself, is there any way in which this agency or that agency is going to intersect with the private company that I'm writing about? And in this case, yes, it turned out that the City Department of Public Health, we FOIA'd other agencies as well, but they did have a copy of the audit that Kelly had been tipped off about. And it was pretty stunning revelations in that work, I thought, Kelly.
Yeah, so we were able to use that audit then after obtaining it through the city's health department to write what became our first story published together, which showed that the majority of Loretto's first wave of doses hadn't gone to the Black and Latinx Chicagoans that it's supposed to serve in its community. And it just highlighted how there were definitely questions about how it had used its doses, and that it wasn't just a few one-off events. There were some true systemic problems with the vaccinations at Loretto. So yes, we turned that into a story. And from there, we had also gotten some other tips. Or I'm sorry, Dave, was there anything else you wanted to add about that instance?
Yeah, just that the hospital had really said they were releasing their audit, and they released a very anodyne, sort of sanitized version of it that didn't contain the really shocking data that came from the FOIA.
And then from there, we continued to report. We used public records and obtained some private records to do some other stories. So I believe then the next major one after that was about how one of Loretto's executives was Anash Ahmed. He was the CFO and COO, and he was the one who had been connected to a lot of these improper vaccinations. And we were getting tips that his good friend, business partner, and next door neighbor in Trump Tower had benefited from their ties and had gotten some pretty sizable contracts at the hospital. So we were able to use the 990s that Loretto files, and it has to show who are its top contractors for, that fiscal year. And we looked, and, out of what is it, the 4 or 5 that they list, it was Samir Suhail had, I think, 3 of them. And so just in that 1 year, it was contracts, and just those few companies that we could see, it was contracts worth about $4 million. So we were then able to use that to confirm the tips we had gotten and to turn that into another story. And then we had a series of other reports. We used records to highlight how politicians and board members at Loretto had benefited from their ties. They'd gotten things like Caribbean trips. They'd gotten political donations from people at the hospital. And David, at any point, stop me if you want to like expound on anything. I just want to get.
I'll just say that as we continue to dig into this, and again, this is a meshing of an enormous flow of tips that's coming into Kelly. We're using all sorts of other records, business records, corporate records, court records, et cetera. And people kept saying to both Kelly and me, why aren't federal officials, there seem to be potential violations of the law here. Why aren't officials investigating this? And that was just with the last minute or so we have here, that was kind of the last FOIA part of this. We had to figure out if they weren't. The authorities weren't talking to us about what they were doing. And so we did this again through FOIAs, and we FOIA'd for subpoenas that government agencies might have gotten from federal investigators asking for or demanding records about the things we were writing about. And the first FOIA we did for subpoenas got no results, but Kelly and I decided to keep sending those FOIAs repetitively, since this was such a fast-moving, breaking situation. And on the second round of FOIAs, we did 4 subpoenas. We did get a result showing that the FBI was investigating Kelly's original initial scoops about the vaccinations in Trump Tower. And so that that method in a breaking news investigation of filing a FOIA, you get nothing back. But Kelly and I sort of worked out a schedule where we keep filing these FOIAs, because over time it did turn out that the FBI was investigating the things Kelly had exposed. I think we might, just for time's sake, pause here and turn to Madison and Cecilia, and if people obviously in the chat or however you can communicate with us have questions, we'll have time at the end.
Ooh, are we sharing?
Yeah, it's working
great.
You're sharing.
Okay, great. Well, perfect timing. That was the good time. Well, these 2 stories I think are actually going to work pretty well together, because if they're talking about, with David and Kelly talking about using FOIA for kind of quicker turn stuff and how to like complement your, deadline reporting with longer term stuff. This is about as far as the opposite of a quick turn as you could get. This was a very, very long term story. And so Cecilia and I worked on a project called The Failures Before the Fires, which is a story all about building code violations that were found prior to real fires, and particularly building code violations that played a role in fire safety in some way, that were left unaddressed and in some cases contributed to deaths. And we put up this screenshot here in the background showing that a very, very similar story was done by the BGA and the Tribune in 1980. So we basically just copied old people. So good for us. Ooh, Cecilia put in cool transitions to our slides, I see. Great. Okay, yeah, just quickly some findings over it, and we'll get into a little bit more of this later on. But for the most part, our investigation was focused on the city's system for inspecting and following through on enforcement for building code violations. And we went at this through the lens of the end effect of being fires, but really it was a story about any types of building safety. You could do, you could have used the same method to look at like lead paint or gas leaks or anything along those lines. But some of the big highlights that we found were that tenants calling 311 to complain about an unsafe aspect of their building, a lot, did not receive the response they had hoped. Some were not even addressed at all. We saw that violations were closed out with nothing being done about it, when the inspector either knew that the issue remained or had no evidence to suggest that it had been fixed, at least. Things languished in housing court for years. There was no standardization about how to respond to the same issue. So, for example, if there was a smoke detector violation, there's no rule that says we need to treat that very, very seriously, and everything needs to go to court. We found that in some cases, a landlord might get hit with a warning, where in other cases, they're taken to court for the same reason. So basically, there's a lot of subjectivity in there. And ultimately, we found that 61 people died over a 6-year time period in buildings where the city was aware of very serious fire safety hazards. And we looked at all fatal fires during that time period, which ultimately ended up being 140 within the kind of categorizations that we chose, but we actually examined probably at 30 more than that. And this was something we wanted to include, just showing that one of the quotes that we got back from the city officials charged with this, when we did a very extensive closeout process with them, where we really gave the city officials every single detail that we had and everything that we were planning to share about different fires. And there was kind of a level of callousness to it, I guess I think it'd be fair to say, that was pretty shocking to us about the reaction and the responsibility that was not being taken from the city officials. So kind of backing up on what we want to focus on with this, Cecilia and I actually presented FOIA Fest last year about this project before our story came out. And so we had to do everything like anonymized. And so we're going to share some of that because we have some templates that we used for that to showcase kind of how we kept organized with this, because this was a huge test of organization. I got started on this before Cecilia came on board, just kind of generally poking around on it, and had gotten to the point where we realized we wanted to look at the same records for each and every fatal fire to make sure that we were starting with a non-biased group there. We weren't like picking out just the fires that we thought were bad or anything. So the big aspect with that was that I think we originally had like about 170, and all the FOIA officers that I spoke to about this kind of like, guffawed at the idea of me FOIAing for 170 fire incident reports or anything like that. So we just decided that the big ones we wanted to go with were, for sure, the Department of Buildings, any sort of inspection history reports and complaints, and the fire department report. And then for fatal fires in Chicago, there's always a police report as well. So we wanted those 3 from each fire, and eventually we'll get into it more, but we did a lot of other record requests for them too. But to get started with it, I negotiated with each of the FOIA officers to essentially like the smallest common number that they would all be willing to do during a FOIA period. And they decided that was 10. So we created a spreadsheet, and we'll get into it in a little bit, and created a plan and just started strategically doing 10 every 2 weeks. And just something I think is really important with this is that it was all common access. So that way, like, I had some interns working on this with me in the beginning, so everybody could keep track of who was filing what, who was in charge of what, but everybody had access to viewing everything. And that made it a lot easier when me and Cecilia started working together to just kind of hit the ground running. And yeah, this is just something I wanted to show, that this is one of the things we used. Is I used a Google form to keep track of all of our FOIA requests. And it's mine, it says my name with it, but I adapted it for other people's by its requester, so we can see who's in charge of it, who's kind of taking the helm at each one, and how to follow through on it. And this is ultimately what it looks like when it goes into the spreadsheet. We have it set up to have notification date and a final due date, the auto-populate. And this is something that's very nerdy, and it's a little crossed off here, but I always highly recommend in situations like this, when you're doing the same type of FOIA, we ended up having to do this same type of FOIA 17 times over, the same round 17 times over. So it doesn't really help if we just say like, oh, the CFD FOIA we filed in February. We needed something a little bit more specific. So it auto-populated a unique ID for each FOIA request that we ended up tracking throughout the process. And it ended up being very, very helpful later on to just understand, like, we'd be looking at a fire report that we requested a year ago and saying, hey, it looks like there's a page cut off. I could very easily go back to where we originally sent that, find the email thread, and see if we cut something off or they missed something. And this is just another plug that, with something being so large as it is, I knew we wanted everything to be as standardized as possible. So I used Zapier to create something that would just I put all of the fires into a spreadsheet, and Zapier used this to create case files in the same format for every single fire that we then filled in with all of the FOIAs that we had. And I think this is where I was going to. Oh yeah, so
you can keep going though.
Yeah, also you're going to show this? This is what essentially I was supposed to create. And so I had a different spreadsheet that we can share this with you if you want as well, that YouTube would have an ID, and the FIRE IDs are different than the FOIA ones, where we would keep track of all of the different FOIAs, where we're at on them, and then that is connected to a different sheet where we could actually take notes on all of it. And going back to what we had over here, this is what, just a screenshot of what Cecilia and I ended up using for the most part. And this really was like the, you know, the be all end all for our organization of it. Like we put everything into this overview. We put everything into the spreadsheet. It was so important for keeping track of everything. And we knew that if it was in here, it was accurate and it was up to date. And within each of these, I want to show is that there's links to the individual case files for each fire. And so while we use this to kind of use bigger, you know, look for bigger trends and to understand all of that, within each 170 fires, we had something like this, where this is what I use Zapier to create, where we'd have a Google Doc for just like the notes, a spreadsheet, which gives us where we filled in the timelines of every single, you know, complaint that was filed leading up to a fire and building inspection and all of that. And then the files is where we would keep all the FOIAs for each fire. So all of this was like, you know, seems very crazy and anal, and I get that. But I'll say it really, really helped in the long run, because it's just so easy when you're dealing with such a repetitive task with that to confuse, like, oh yeah, was that the fire that was over in Rogers Park? Okay, well there's 5, you know, so you have to keep track of it and separate some way. I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia.
Do you want to keep presenting though? Because I don't think I figured it out yet. So I'll just let you know when you can click or whatever. Yeah, so one of the things that was great about that template, which I dropped in the chat for people who are interested, is that whenever you were working on a specific case or a fire for us, the column would highlight in like a different tab. And so you would know like which, oh, nice, thank you. So you would know which one you were looking at, because it was, again, like Madison was saying, lots of different cases would get lost. Or like could easily get lost with all of the FOIAs that we were doing for each of them, which, as Madison was saying, at the very start of it, we try to keep fairly consistent with 3 main agencies that we were looking at: the Department of Buildings, Police Department, the Fire Department, but we later complemented with multiple other FOIAs, especially for the ones that we then became interested in, because we thought that there may be something there. So we also FOIA'd for 311 records, administrative hearing procedures, the Department of Law. A lot of the times we were getting like the same information, but there were examples, actually there were multiple cases when we would get the same but slightly more, especially from, say, 311. So the Department of Buildings would include some complaints. And this is a danger, I think, whenever you're FOIAing anything, like what you get back is not necessarily everything that exists, but just everything that that FOIA officer, you know, actually decided to give to you. So with 311, we received a lot more complaints than we got from the Department of Buildings. And, you know, this is not to say that they were trying to hide anything. It's just like sometimes things fall through the cracks. So requesting things, even when we didn't, even when we knew that we were going to get some overlap, was key in, I guess, oh, go ahead, David.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, did you do all that string for every single fire, or did you do the first 3? Oh, you did everything for every fire. Okay.
Oh, no, not everything. So we did the first 3 for every single fire.
Right.
And then from that, we tried to at least identify the ones that we thought were a bit more promising. And then we ended up going through, or even the ones that we had questions on. So especially when we were FOIAing 311, the Department of Hearings, and we were getting back records that we didn't get from the first 3 batches, like that cast doubt on how we had made the first determination. Right. And so if we had questions, then we would also go back and re-request for the other ones. I think we actually ended up requesting 311 for a fair number of all of the fires just because of that phenomenon, that we were getting a sense that we were not getting everything.
Yeah, see, in hindsight, and we all both realized we wish we would have just done 311 for every single fire, just because of like the number we were getting. But by the time we kind of came around to that, we couldn't do it for every single one. So
yeah,
and did all agencies equally disclose, or among them were there some agencies where you faced obstacles or barriers?
Yeah, so I would say 311 was a little bit reticent with the records at the beginning. We also asked for data. So we were requesting paper files for all of the fires, but we were also requesting data from the Department of Buildings, 311, and I think that's it. And we were expecting to see like the stuff that we got back in the paper reflected in the data as well. The data request we got some pushback on, but eventually I think we got everything from 311 and from the Department of Buildings. Yeah,
the only other thing I'd say on that is that we got some pushback from the fire department and the police department sometimes about them saying that the fire department wouldn't release records because the police department says that the case is still open, even though it's been 3-4 years. And that would require just kind of like some diplomacy where we'd have to go to the police department and be like, why is this still open? And they'd be like, oh, that's a mistake, and close it. And then go back to the fire department and be like, look, it's closed now. Can we have the records? And stuff like that, which was a process.
Right. Yeah. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Oh yeah, lots of documents. Yeah, another one, please. Okay, thank you. So one thing that we also wish we had done at the very beginning, oh no, go back, sorry, Madison. One thing we wish we had done at the very beginning was to actually start, as we were processing these FOIAs, linking back to where we were finding all of the information that we had. So Madison showed in the cases that we were documenting, we had a file structure. So we would, oh my God. So we would have like Word documents, and we would have a spreadsheet, which included a timeline for every single fire. But
nobody watched this.
We didn't always link out to the part in the FOIA that we were getting the information from. So we would have memos to each other like, this is what happened, and they didn't hear smoke detectors, or they said that they didn't, but then they interviewed somebody later that said that they did. But we didn't actually have the links to where we had found that information. So at the very end of our first pass at reporting this, we had to go back and essentially build that back for each one of those cases. And we tried to do ones that the other person had done. So if Madison had handled 903 North Lawndale, then I would have done the checking of where everything came from. Okay, so here's everything that was being kept, including the memos that we were writing for each other. And
which
so as
really helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, which was very helpful, especially because we could follow up on questions that the other person had. And it was easier to, like Madison was saying, keep track of everything that we were trying to process in the same way. Like we didn't want to get, really bogged down on just one case, or we didn't want to miss things that we had done for other cases. And so when we were doing this fact checking for ourselves, if you will, when we were like second guessing the other person's findings, we realized that you can actually like comment out documents on Google Drive, and you can link to those comments. And so here Madison is going through a case that I had read through, and she was highlighting how we knew every piece of information that we thought we knew about the fire. And so that's the name of the person who died, any comments about the condition of the building at the time, which played into our methodology of figuring out whether the problem existed at the time of the fire or not. Anything that was noted in the code violation section. This is a fire report, by the way. And so when having these links and the ability to go back and see where everything we were basing our conclusions on came from was really, really helpful. And I wish we had done it from the very beginning of our first FOIA intake, I guess. Yeah.
So also wanted to say on that too, like it was so tedious and, you know, frustrating.
Yes.
Cecilia and I would basically go back and like double down on our work. Like we just did what the other person's been doing for, you know, a year at that point, but in super speed. It was really frustrating and difficult, but I'm so happy that we did it because we actually, you know, things changed quite a bit. Like we found fires that we had been considering in what we would call in our parlance as strong, which meant that we had determined there was evidence to show that the city knew of a fire safety issue that remained. We found issues that we thought were strong all along that we really questioned, and ones that we hadn't really taken much of a second look at the beginning, and we're like, oh, this is significant. So yeah. That is.
I have a question if I can.
Sure.
Thanks. I was really struck by your note about how you were interacting with FOIA officers and with government officials around your FOIAs. You know, a FOIA is a legal demand for public records, but it's also a very human interaction sometimes. Can you guys talk about your sort of philosophy, your approach to talking with FOIA officers, and what you learned about the FOIA process from those conversations?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that. I say that for my take with FOIA, at least in Illinois, was always, you know, try to be nice at first, right? Try to negotiate something to get on a good side with them, because especially with a situation like this, I realized I was going to be really annoying to them for like most of a year, if not more, right? When I was looking down the pike of how many FOIAs you're going to file. And so, but eventually, you know, things were delayed and overdue. And I actually think only the Department of Buildings was really the only one that was actually responding to things on time-ish. And for the most part, I just kind of took it on a case-by-case situation. Like with the fire department, they were really behind, but it was one FOIA officer who I was working with and started to develop a good relationship with, to where I had to kind of be human and understand, like, hey, it was due in 2 weeks and you didn't do it, but also I filed 15 of these, so I will give you a little bit of a break. Whereas with the police department, which there was many different FOIA officers, they were not really communicating with each other, and they were just kind of, they weren't, I would say, acting in good faith, in my opinion, at least about it. They weren't like making good progress. And so those were the situations in which we would get more forceful. And we had, you know, with the BGA, we had our lawyer write a couple letters and start moving things along. And yeah, Cecilia, anything?
Yeah, no, I think in general, for this project and in general, like the approach is usually that I tell the FOIA officer, like, that I'm going to be filing a lot of requests, try to be transparent about what it is that I'm trying to see, and open up a dialogue with them at the very beginning. Because as the documents come in, you're going to have more questions, and you're going to be filing more requests. So there's no point in kind of like dropping that FOIA request and act as if, you know, like they have to give stuff to you right away, which, you know, there are guidelines, but at the same time, like, I don't think FOIA request is something that should be done in a vacuum, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Dawn has a question in the chat that's saying, in terms of synthesizing all this information into the story you created, I'd love to know more about how you landed on the story angle of fatal fires in buildings with known fire safety issues. Was that something that revealed itself through the data, or did you go into reporting with that angle in mind? That is a really good question, and something we also were just talking about, you know, Cecilia, that I got started with this was after the Little Village fire that happened. And for those of you who don't remember, it was 2018. There was 10 children from, you know, one extended family for the most part that all died in a fire, and it was incredibly horrific. And there was like a lot of media reports around it because it was, you know, I think it was the most deadly fire for, at least involving children, since the Our Lady of Angels fire, or tied for the church, something like that. Anyway, but there's a lot of media coverage about the building code violations and how this landlord had been in court, and everybody was really, you know, kind of transfixed by it. And I was too. But then it all kind of just faded away. Nothing happened. I remember Rahm Emanuel saying stuff like, we're going to get to the bottom of this, about like, how could this have happened? Why would the city have known? And so that just kind of stuck in my mind that we never really heard anything more about it. And from there, I started to just hear kind of more about more and more fires and just kind of noticing it. And when we first started to really dive into it, I wanted to be really cognizant of not just jumping to the conclusion that it was building code violations. Like, there seemed to be a very clear tie there, but I wanted to keep my mind open that it could be other things. Like, for example, we were hearing a lot about in some of the early cases that are more high profile, we looked into about DCFS issues, about there being DCFS investigations relating to a lot of these families. And I was thinking, okay, is there something there? Are they not doing proper home studies or something like that? And or could it be something like firefighter response time or anything? So we really did cast a wide net at the beginning, but the more and more we got into it, the more obvious this was the running thread.
Great. We have a question here from Diane Scott. How specific and broad were the Loretto FOIA requests? For example, how did you phrase the request to the City Department of Public Health to get the vax information you wanted? I do want to say to everybody, I apologize that we're not familiar enough with Hop-In to all be screen sharing with you. And if you do want to get copies of FOIAs, you can email me, djackson@bettergov.org, or Kelly, and we'll share what we can with you. So I'll just very quickly, because of the trouble with screen sharing, just say that the request is very, very short. It fits literally in a half a page. And this is to the City Department of Public Health. It begins, as dear FOIA officer, as you know, public health officials in Chicago temporarily paused COVID-19 vaccinations at Loretto Hospital after the hospital improperly distributed vaccines. Chicago's Department of Public Health said in a statement, and we linked to it, that it had reviewed an internal audit conducted by Loretto Hospital and interviewed hospital leadership involved with the vaccine. So what we did in that very first graph is provide context to an event in the real world to orient the FOIA officers to getting what we wanted. The other sort of broad sweeping approaches would say, show us all audits that you did or collected from Loretto Hospital. But in this case, we decided to really pinpoint what had happened to focus them. And then we said, under FOIA and all applicable state and federal open records laws, please provide Chicago Department of Public Health's copy of Loretto's internal audit report, as well as any other audits or examinations by the department or others of Loretto's vaccination program conducted since March 1st, 2021. And then I put in a graph that we decided was going to help. We believe the referenced audit is not deliberative, but is factual in nature, and that it likely references public figures, including, and then we named several Loretto officials. Again, that's sort of an inoculating type paragraph against a potential denial that we anticipated. And then we said, we're on deadline. We appreciate anything you can do to expedite. We sort of said who we are in a sentence. And then we put in the language, we believe the requested records are meaningfully informative about government operations, likely to contribute to an increased public understanding of an important topic and not already in the public domain. Those 3 points are kind of the pillars of, if you're going to sue for the records, what you need to establish in court.
Someone else is asking, could a story such as the fire story be applied to any city? And how did you determine how far back in time to track fatal fires? So yes, to the first question, I think. The second question is embarrassing. I mean, we wanted it to come out sooner than it did. And so when we were going back to 2014, we were thinking, oh, the last 5 years. And then, we ended up publishing in 2021, which is the nature of things. But one thing we didn't mention actually is that when we requested records from all of these departments, we were going back 10 years. So we were asking for anything that they had kept track of 10 years before 10 years before the fire, I believe. And in some cases, we actually went back 10 more years when we didn't get everything that we thought could be there, or we had more questions. And in some cases, that was needed, that was helpful.
Yeah. So I want to say, like, on the first part of that, with could this be done anywhere? I think yes. Like, it's at its core, this is like a really simple story. We just extrapolated it like a bunch of times over, right? It's just, there was a tragedy. What did the city know in advance? It's easy to apply that to a lot of different situations. And when we were doing some follow-ups after the main series came out, we were looking into like where other cities have had such a thing. And there was a very similar incident happened in Washington, D.C. that they did a really good coverage of it as well, but just kind of on a one-off fire there. So there's a lot of possibilities.
I have a question for Kelly Bauer. The Loretto investigation was obviously very fast moving and competitive, and you're in another very similar situation right now. You've been breaking news about the pop-up COVID test clinics and problems in those, and indeed your reports have followed again with federal scrutiny and government law enforcement investigations. Are you using FOIA in this new investigation you're doing, or not?
I am using FOIA. What I've done actually is using some of the lessons that Dave taught me when we were working on our Loretto stories last spring. And for example, I knew with these testing facilities that in order to get more detailed information about what were some of the issues happening behind the scenes, we needed to go to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, since that's the agency that oversees those labs. And I just flat out asked their spokespeople, can you provide me these inspection reports, or is it going to be something that you make me FOIA for? And in doing that, they were actually extremely helpful and have provided some of these reports and information like that. So I found that was helpful. But what I have had to FOIA for is something that we did with Loretto, which is when we wanted to determine, like, okay, so who is investigating this, if anyone? You know, if it's the FBI or the Illinois Attorney General's office, things like that. And so when Dave and I had been trying to determine that with Loretto, we had used FOIAs to look into, you know, what kind of subpoenas have been issued to different agencies. And so that's something that I've been using as well, and have used that to confirm different investigations. So yeah, just kind of going back to that floor plan with Loretto and using that to, you know, confirm that an investigation is ongoing, since a lot of the times those agencies won't actually tell you.
I'd like to just quickly read that, just the salient language about the subpoenas. And again, we can share this with people. The salient language that we put into that FOIA was sort of in the middle of, again, a very short FOIA request, but we would typically insert the language, quote, as you know, such subpoenas are considered public record and thus routinely released by, name your department, and other agencies subject to disclosure under Section 7, parentheses 2, on parentheses, and other provisions of FOIA, comma 5 ILCS 140/7, parentheses 2. So we were again trying to sort of inoculate ourselves to an official thinking, oh my gosh, that's a scary request. I've never seen anything like this. I'll deny it. And we were trying to say this is very routine, and we do it all the time.
I have a question for David and Kelly. I think you were kind of getting into this with the FOIA for any investigations, but what were some of the FOIAs that were not necessarily the backbone of what ended up being published, but that were still very helpful to you?
We FOIA'd for inspection records. Kelly had done that before I joined. And so she'd already started to FOIA for hospital inspection records from the Department of Public Health. And we really doubled down on that group of FOIAs and expanded the time frame, and also expanded the number of hospitals we were looking at. One of the things that we showed was that there was an uptick in safety problems at Loretto during and safety violations during the administration that we were really looking at. So that was something Kelly had already started to do that we kind of expanded and built on.
I just want a quick add, just to make sure credit where credit's due. It was one of our freelancers, Justin Lawrence, who initially had the idea to FOIA for those reports, and it ended up being extremely helpful.
And then we have a question about filing the back-to-back FOIAs. We would wait for a denial from one FOIA, and then we'd file again pretty much right away during that time period.
Dave, do you see that second question from Kinsey about why do you think that was successful in turning a no responsive documents response into a successful response? Yeah, why do you think?
I really don't know. It's interesting when you look at, and again, I'm so sorry I can't share screen shots. When you look at the FOIA, we filed our FOIA for these subpoenas after the subpoenas had been received. So you'd think in kind of legal terms, we would have just gotten the subpoenas, but we didn't the first time. And I don't know why that is. And we could have probably done, a deeper look into that by filing FOIAs for emails and other things to see if there was discussion about why they didn't immediately release it. Again, we were sort of in the context of a fast-moving breaking investigation and wanted to keep focused on the new facts that we were receiving. But that really did, for me, remain a troubling mystery. I do know that FOIAs for things like subpoenas, or as Cecilia and Madison pointed out, for things like investigations that are being done collaboratively by the police and the fire department, can be delayed while those agencies communicate with each other. And that might be the reason, but we never found out.
And sorry if you mentioned this already, but did you ever have to actually get like a lawyer involved? Did you have to send a legal letter ever or anything like that?
We got a lawyer involved when they threatened us, I think, but right? I don't remember. Kelly, do you remember if we did it for the FOIAs?
I don't think that we needed to at any point for the FOIAs, yeah.
Okay.
I have one quick question for Kelly. So and David mentioned the pop-up stories or the stories on the pop-up sites, which have been great. I wonder, what are your sort of routine FOIA requests around breaking stories that you tend to file? Maybe even ones that don't yield something, that the public eventually sees, but things that you're always kind of keeping in the back of your mind.
Yeah. So when it comes to both these Loretto and the testing pop-up stories, there's actually been a lot of similarities in kind of how these places are run, since, they're all healthcare related. And so I've been able to do a lot of the same FOIAs. And so that's things like, the first thing is if you hear about an issue, like we were hearing customers talk about, then you want to look into like, okay, so have there been officially reported issues? Have there been complaints? And so you go to those agencies that would get those kinds of complaints. So places like the Illinois, sorry, my dog is moving around again. Places like the Illinois Attorney General's office where people can file complaints. Places like, in these cases, the Illinois Department of Public Health or Chicago Department of Public Health, where people can file complaints about healthcare agencies. And then, of course, you look like federal, too. So with these testing facilities, they are regulated by a federal agency. So I go to those. So that's usually my first stop, is to look at, like, if people have concerns or if there was some sort of issue, what is the official documentation on those concerns? And yeah, I think that's been the biggest one that's helped during these reports. And sometimes also looking into just what kind of response there has been. So I know that we, at the beginning of the Loretto stories, also FOIA'd for emails at City Hall to see what had been the chatter around this, what had officials been saying, was there anything that could be newsworthy in there? So that was helpful too, is to just get that insider look at what they were saying about these stories and how they were reacting.
Thank you.
Great question here from Sarah Hyman. She wants to know, Cecilia and Madison, if things change when you're looking at city-owned buildings, schools, libraries, fire stations, other city-owned or leased buildings. would your list of FOIAs work with them, or would you do other things?
I know that that's a really good question, first off, but for the most part, what we were looking at, like with building inspection reports, that is all the same as far as I'm aware for city-owned buildings. Like we definitely came across a couple of city-owned buildings just randomly through it that they, can have the same, they run one complaints and inspection reports and all of that. But I also know back when I was doing some other reporting on recycling back in the day, there's a lot of records kept about like, what sort of work is done on them and like who works in those. It was the Department of Fleet and Facilities Management. I think that's what it's called. I think it's now under the Department of Assets and Innovation or whatever that one is, the one that's essentially the tech hub. I should look it up. Assets Information Services. I believe Fleet and Facility Management is now under there, that they'll have some additional records that might be more about like what actually goes on in that building. But yes, for the actual like safety of the building, it would be treated like anything else as far as I know.
And I have a question for Cecilia and Madison. You filed police reports on specific fires, right? Did you file police reports just for all calls to service for specific buildings, or anything more broadly looking at the buildings, or just those individual fire events? That's
a good question. I know Cecilia can talk about doing it for more individual cases. We definitely did that. But in the beginning, when I was still trying to like establish what the universe was of fatal fires, I tried to FOIA from both the fire department and the police department for just like all fatal fire calls. And they both said, okay, we don't have that. We don't keep that information that way, which was frustrating because later we found out they definitely did, but not in a clear spreadsheet format, I guess. We did end up getting all FOIA calls, all fire calls for just structure fires. But that ended up being super helpful for us because there was no way to narrow down about which ones were fatal, which were residential, what all that happened. And then, yeah, I know, Cecilia, didn't you end up doing like all police for a couple buildings?
I think for a couple of them, yeah, but it was usually a lot more narrowed in, and it wasn't, for the last 10 years or anything like that. So it would have been any like police activity or anything that required police presence within a way more bounded set of time. But it also was kind of guided by the address as the main thing that they were searching for. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So just again, Sarah, to your question, the address of the building and the physical location of the building become a nexus for government activity of all kinds. And that's another thing to think about with libraries and other government-owned buildings, that the address itself will attach to and be a nexus of a lot of types of government activity.
Yeah, and something I wanted to actually mention about that, which isn't super related to your question, but just that how important it was finding the address. It meant everything because, yeah, that was the only way that it could be consistently tracked across all the different agencies, which I'm sure you all know in Chicago can be a nightmare because a lot of buildings have more than one address, right? They'll be on a corner and they'll have a range of two totally different streets. So trying to keep track of all that was really, really difficult. And what we ended up basing our original kind of universe off of when we finally did find a mostly complete list of fatal fires was from the fire department, which puts out like an annual fire death report. But we found out later that a lot of those addresses were just like wrong. They just like were off, they said either complete wrong block or whatever reason. And it was, we had to go back then at that point, and like really Google street maps, all of this, and like make sure we had the exact right address for each one.
Thank you all for attending this session. If you do have more follow-up questions, I know Cecilia, Madison, and Kelly, and certainly I will be glad to help. So look us up and email us if there's more that we can do to help you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.